Good evening, and welcome to the campus of the University of Mary Washington, to the Cedric Rucker University Center, and to this program by the James Monroe Museum, Passionate Politics. We're going to do a little time traveling to 1824 and into a much more recent stop in the 2024 election. We want to thank, as always, the Friends of the James Monroe Museum for their support of our public programming. If anyone here is not a member of the Friends, we encourage you to go to our website or Facebook page to find out information about how to do that. Also want to alert you to a couple of upcoming programs, really the last two we have for 2024. For over 40 years, Jan Williams, who I've called Fredericksburg's Martha Stewart, although I've started to say that Martha Stewart is the rest of the world's Jan Williams in some ways, celebrated floral designer, someone who's done creations for the White House. She has done our Deck the Halls program for all those decades. And this is an opportunity for you to come on December 7th, 2024, give you a different reason to remember that date, at 9:30 a.m. in the Hurley Convergence Center, the digital auditorium on that building on campus. And you will see how Jan crafts holiday decorations in a unique style using local evergreens and flora. It's an entertaining and inspiring annual presentation. She shares stories from all of her years in the business and all her contacts with a number of well-known people. It's really a mainstay of Fredericksburg's celebration of the holidays. And you may be one of the lucky participants chosen at random to take home one of her beautiful natural decorations created right there at the event. So we hope you will join us for Deck the Halls. Here again, go to the museum's webpage for that. You can also stop by the museum. There are some sign-up forms there. I realize we didn't bring them with us here, so that's my mistake, but that's okay. You've got plenty of time. It's December 7th. And a few days later, December 12th, we have the annual holiday open house at the James Monroe Museum, where you see it decorated for the season. You have James and Elizabeth Monroe and maybe other family members present to greet you. Holiday music, refreshments. You can hear the Monroe's Astor pianoforte with holiday airs played on it. So we invite you to that. We are very fortunate tonight as we compare these two eras of American politics, that of the past and that of the much more recent past, to have two marvelous speakers and an extremely experienced and adept moderator to help us try to make sense of it. I'll start with our moderator, Mr. Ed Jones. He is the former editor of the Freelance Star newspaper here in Fredericksburg. He joined the paper as a high school intern in the 1960s. You were very, very young. And during his journalism career, he has served as president of the Virginia Press Association, the National Conference of Editorial Writers, and the Associated Press Managing Editors Association. He has served as a Pulitzer Prize juror, and in 2006 was inducted into the Virginia Communications Hall of Fame. He holds a BA degree from Harvard College and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Virginia Law School. Dr. Daniel Feller, in the middle there, is Distinguished Professor in the Humanities Emeritus and Editor and Director Emeritus of the Papers of Andrew Jackson at the University of Tennessee. A specialist in 19th century American political history, he is the author of The Public Lands in Jacksonian Politics and The Jacksonian Promise, America, 1815 to 1840. He's also the editor of 6 volumes of the Papers of Andrew Jackson. Dr. Feller has published several dozen articles, essays, book chapters, and reviews, and has appeared on numerous television shows. Last but certainly not least, our own Dr. Stephen Farnsworth is Professor of Political Science and International Affairs and Director of the Center for Leadership and Media Studies here at the University of Mary Washington. He is the author or co-author of 9 books on the presidency, the mass media, public opinion, and journalism. He's also received he's a recipient of the Virginia Outstanding Faculty Award from the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia. So please join me in welcoming this wonderful panel as we dive into this I know, engaging topic.
Well, let me add my thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion. And with that, let me ask either one of you who would care to be the first one to give us a few comments to begin the evening.
First, let me say I'm delighted to be here and thank you all for coming. On the assumption that when we're going to compare two things, it's best to know a little bit about both of them, I'm going to give you a crash course on the election of 1824. One of the most complicated and consequential of all American presidential elections, and perhaps the most misunderstood. It was the first election to feature a populist-flavored rebellion against the political establishment. It was the second, and so far the last, election to be decided in the House of Representatives. It was the first election where the man who got the most popular votes didn't win. It is still the only election where the man who got the most electoral votes didn't win. It was set the stage for a famous rematch 4 years later in 1828 between John Quincy Adams, who, as you will see, did win, and one of the losers, challenger Andrew Jackson. And that election 4 years later in 1828 is one of the most storied in American history. And finally, 1824 furnished the classic, paradigm-setting, finger-pointing tale of an election stolen away from the American people by Washington intrigue and corruption. Ironically, it was also the only presidential election that worked pretty much the way founding fathers expected they would. Well, for 24 years before this, the presidency had been handed down like a family estate within Thomas Jefferson's so-called Democratic Republican, or simply Republican, Party. Jefferson himself, his hand-picked successor, James Madison, and then James Monroe, each serving 2 terms. Well, in 1824, the end of Monroe's tenure brought this Virginia dynasty to a close, and 4 candidates for the presidency emerged. The inside man, the one who was favored by the party establishment, including Jefferson and Madison, who are both still alive, the one who could best claim that it was his turn, was this guy, Virginia-born William Harris Crawford, who was Monroe's Secretary of the Treasury. Another candidate, also in Monroe's cabinet, was his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts. Now, even though he was the son of Jefferson's old antagonist, John Adams, Quincy Adams, who was a Federalist, of course, Quincy Adams years before had jumped over to the Democratic Republican Party, and in fact, all of these candidates were members of that party. Third candidate. Hello? The powerful, influential, and marvelously articulate Henry Clay of Kentucky, Speaker of the House of Representatives. And then the wild card in the race, is this guy, Andrew Jackson, something of an outsider in Washington, but a transcendent popular hero for vanquishing the British at the Battle of New Orleans at the end of the War of 1812. Well, in previous years, the Jeffersonians had used a caucus of party congressmen in Washington to pick their nominee for president. And in the absence of serious competition, now that the old Federalist Party had collapsed, picking the party nominee meant essentially picking the president himself. National nominating conventions, like we have today, were still about 10 years off in the future at this point, and primary elections were way off in the future. There was a lot of convenience to having a caucus do the picking. The caucus was composed of congressmen from all over the country, so it was more or less representative. They were all in Washington anyway, at a time when it wasn't easy to travel. Well, in 1824, a congressional caucus met and duly nominated the insider candidate, William Harris Crawford. But supporters of all the other three candidates attacked the caucus as being anti-democratic, an insider's plot to thwart the people's will. The caucus sank into disrepute, and Crawford's candidacy sank with it. Well, the campaign that followed was confused and at best semi-organized. Not every candidate competed in every state. In fact, in only a handful of states did all four candidates field electoral tickets for voters to choose from. In several states, for instance, the Adams and Jackson people together ran what were called fusion tickets, with the idea that whoever won, whoever did well elsewhere in the country, they'd vote for that guy. Voter turnout varied wildly from one state to another. And in 6 states, there were 24 states, so in 6 of them, out of 24, there was no popular vote at all. The state legislature, as it's entitled to do under the Constitution, simply appointed the state's electors. Now, 5 of those states were pretty small, but the 6th was New York, which was by far the largest state in the Union. Well, here's the result, and if this looks complicated, it is. Andrew Jackson led in both the popular and the electoral vote, but he had nowhere near the majority of the electoral vote that you need to win. He had 99, Adams had 84, Crawford had 41, Henry Clay had 37. And so, as decreed by the United States Constitution, the choice between the top 3 candidates, this is in the Constitution, went to the House of Representatives. And the idea is that in the House of Representatives, each state delegation, this is New York with 34 congressmen, and Illinois and Missouri with 1 each state gets 1 vote. With 24 states, it took 13 state delegations in the House of Representatives to win. Well, Henry Clay, who actually beat Crawford a little bit in the popular vote, but the overall popular vote doesn't matter. In the electoral college, Henry Clay came in 4th, which meant he was out of the running. Only the top 3 advance. Clay and Adams had never been close, and they had differed strongly on many matters, and yet, several weeks before the House of Representatives was to vote, Clay announced that he would support Adams on the grounds that, like him or not, and Clay didn't, Adams was a responsible adult. He was an accomplished statesman. No one doubted his competence. No one doubted his mental equilibrium, whereas Jackson was, in Clay's famous words, a mere military chieftain. A potential American Caesar or Bonaparte, a man on horseback, a violent and perhaps dangerous man. And I'll simply say there was a lot of reason to think that about Jackson in 1824. I won't go into his history, but it was there. By the Crawford, during all this time, had had a stroke and had also run way behind the other 2 in the Electoral College, so Crawford is essentially out of the running. With Clay's effective support, Adams, when it came to the vote in the House of Representatives, got exactly the 13 states in the first ballot that it needed to win. 7 of those states had gone for him in the Electoral College, 3 of them had gone for Clay, and 3 had gone for Jackson. Having won the election in the House of Representatives, Adams shortly announced that Henry Clay would be his Secretary of State, and at this, Andrew Jackson went ballistic. I'm quoting, "So you see the Judas of the West has closed the contract and will receive the 30 pieces of silver. Was there ever witnessed such a barefaced corruption in any country before?" The headline on one of Jackson's leading newspapers blared, and I quote again, "Expired at Washington on the 9th of February, 1825, the virtue, liberty, and independence of the United States." By the way, all those words in capital letters. The virtue, liberty, and independence of the United States expired caused by poison administered by the assassin hand of John Quincy Adams, the usurper, and Henry Clay. Well, Adams took the inaugural oath on March 4th with cries of corrupt bargain rising all around him. His administration was practically doomed from the start. For the next 4 years, a tide of outrage against the aristocratic so-called coalition of Adams and Clay, and a tide of enthusiasm for Andrew Jackson, the people's man and now the people's martyr, rose inexorably. In 1828, that tide swept Andrew Jackson into the White House. Well, what can we learn from all this? An obvious lesson, one that still resonates today, is this: heed the people and beware of politicians. Virtue resides in the voters, and corruption breeds in Washington. That lesson is why Americans to this day look at the idea of a decision made by the House of Representatives, which has never happened again, or in some other proverbial smoke-filled room with something approaching horror. But a second, I would say, and subtler lesson is this: while the past shapes the future, as we all know, what can really matter most in influencing events down the road is not what really happened, but what people think happened. In 1824, a losing candidate, that's Andrew Jackson, claimed that he was the popular choice, but that the election had been stolen from him. These claims propelled him to victory in the next election. You will still find that statement, "the election was stolen by a corrupt bargain between Adams and Clay," in a lot of textbooks ever since, even though it's not by any means simply true, and perhaps it's closer to simply false. First, the corrupt bargain accusation was likely simply false. Clay had every good reason to support Adams, the reasons he gave, over Jackson. And Adams had every good reason, with no bargain being made, to appoint Clay Secretary of State. In fact, for reasons I won't go into, Clay was such an obvious appointee for Secretary of State. He had wanted the job for more than 8 years and was very well qualified for it. It would have been astonishing not to appoint him. As for the popular vote, Andrew Jackson won the popular vote. Well, sorta. Remember that the turnout varied wildly from state to state, so the aggregate popular vote doesn't mean that much. And the absence of New York State alone is enough to discredit it. The electoral vote in New York, where the state legislature appointed the electors, Adams got 26 electoral votes. The other 3 candidates together got 10, of which Andrew Jackson got 1. And if you assume that a popular vote in New York, if it had been held, would have reflected more or less that same breakdown, and if turnout had been decent in New York, then Adams probably would have gotten so many popular votes in New York that he would have wound up winning the popular vote. To take a recent example, who won the popular vote in 2016? Everybody know? Hillary Clinton. Well, if you don't count California, Donald Trump won it. That's actually true. But of course you do count California, because California is the largest state in the Union. Why wouldn't you count it? Well, in 1824, they didn't count New York. Yet it is hard to overturn conventional wisdom, however flawed, once it solidifies. Jackson lost the 1824 election, but he won the narrative. And in the end, that's what mattered most. And one last thing, events can look very different in retrospect than they had in prospect, depending on what happens afterwards. Because they opposed each other again in 1828, we think of Adams and Jackson, when we think of them at all, as kind of arch antagonists. That's true after 1824. It's true because of 1824. And yet, up until the moment when Henry Clay announced his support for Adams, Adams and Jackson had not been antagonists. They had been allies. They had closely cooperated throughout the Monroe administration. They were, in fact, united. Each one would have been perfectly happy to see the other one win the election. One of the things that united them was that they both hated and loathed and wanted to defeat the insider candidate, the guy nobody remembers anymore, William Harris Crawford. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm delighted to be here to talk with you about two very interesting presidential elections. The end of James Monroe's second term, 200 years ago, marked the end of the era of good feelings, as it was called. And I don't think we've really had an era of good feelings in American politics since. Indeed, we can think of most of the past decade as the era of unusually bad feelings. Sore losers and even sore winners populate our presidential elections of 2016 and 2020, 24, as well as the elections in between. Andrew Jackson's 1824 campaign, and even more so his campaigns in 1828 and 1832, marked the rise of American populism in U.S. presidential elections, a trend that has continued to this day. Jackson and his political descendants argued against the elite control of politics in his era, a time where the early generations of our founding fathers took turns guiding the young country and more or less appointing their successors. At this time, as the U.S. was about to reach its 50th birthday, politics and technology were in a period of extraordinary tumult. And much of the technological advancement of this era aided the rise of a politics very focused on mass rule and the opposition to elite rule, the other side of the same coin. States that had property qualifications for voting abolished them. Nearly all of the states that did not allow voters to select their electors and presidential candidates removed those restrictions. The steam engine greatly shortened distances in a geographically large and ever-growing country. The steam engine, first steamboats and then rail. The steam engine also dramatically reduces the cost of producing newspapers, which connects the world in a way that was never the case before. We had the rise of penny press, and a mass literacy movement was also going on, for whites, of course, making it possible for a growing number of citizens to be part of this political system, to be part of the political conversation, and to challenge the elites that for the first 50 years of this country had made it more or less their own. So 1824, to put it plainly, is a period of extraordinary cultural and political tumult. And it's not unlike the social media tumult of our own age. I would argue that Jackson in 1824 is the first truly populist candidate in American politics, and he really sets the stage for the elite versus mass arguments that continue to this day. As you look at election after election in the 19th century, the 20th century, the 21st century, the question is, who is more the representative of the people, and who is more the representative of the elites? And they fight over this with extraordinary vigor, more than they fight over issues in some ways, is the definition of who is the real populist. Now, I would argue that, that Jackson was very well suited to his era, in that there were a variety of factors, like those I've mentioned, pushing the country in a more populist direction. The other asset that Jackson had is that he wasn't a creature of Washington. He was an outsider. He had been a senator and a congressman, but only briefly. His real career was a national military hero, not a Washington politician. And his career as a military officer in the field was a successful one, militarily. He, of course, was most famous for his victory in the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. He also served as a federal military commissioner in Florida and following his controversial actions in the Seminole Wars. His military exploits and his combative nature made him a media-friendly, dare we say viral figure, much more so than any of his contemporaries. And one of the things that endeared him so much to the public, and we see this in politicians who've come after Jackson, is that the clashing with Washington insiders can be taken as a badge of honor. Now, in 1824, this did not lead to victory for Jackson, but his fights with, quote, the deep state of his day created an opportunity for him to win the rematch in 1828. And for the generations of politicians that follow, they often tread on that same ground that Jackson laid out. The populist argument, prickly relations with Washington insiders, the idea that you are a man or a woman of the people. These are the key dynamics that follow Jackson and affect politicians in the decades that follow. Now, I've been asked to talk a little bit about the 2024 dynamics as they relate to some of these points about the earlier election of 200 years ago. And I think when one considers Donald Trump's years in politics, one sees more than a few echoes of Jackson. Certainly, the issues of temperament rise to the fore as we think about this. Trump himself sought to build a public impression of himself as a connection, as connected to the seventh president, 47 and 7 peas in a pod. In fact, when I was putting this together, I was trying to think, is there any president in American history that would be a better source of comparison for Trump besides Jackson? And I have come up empty. So I do think that this is the best comparison one could make. Trump, of course, spoke of Jackson as a personal favorite, and he displayed Jackson's portrait prominently in the Oval Office during his years as president. Joe Biden removed it, but I'm guessing it will appear after January 20th. For Trump, of course, the populist appeal is a central part of his connection to the voters. Trump, like Jackson, makes the most of his outsider status, and he often describes himself as a victim of Washington elites. And in Trump's reading, that includes the 2020 election. When the House selected John Quincy Adams, as my colleague mentioned, Jackson thundered in a way that even sounds a little bit like Trump. You know, was there ever witnessed such a barefaced corruption in any country before? You've heard that quote before, you'll hear it again, but imagine it coming out of the mouth of Donald Trump. It's not really a stretch. And the capitalization that was referred to in the second quotation from my fellow panelist, why, that's how he talks on Twitter as well. When there's a word to be said in capitals, he says it. Now, while historians have not found any evidence of the corrupt bargain securing the presidency for Adams in 1824, it's true that Jackson wins the media framing battle. And one of the things that we appreciate as we look at politics post-Jackson is the role that the media grows and grows and grows in the years that follow. And as for Republicans in 2024, there was great support for Trump's claims that the election had been stolen from him, even though, of course, there is no evidence to support that claim. But that sense of being wronged can really motivate people. It motivated the backers of Jackson going into 1828, and it motivated the backers of Trump going into 2024. Both convey a self-identification as a man of the people doing battle on the public's behalf against elites. Now, many of Jackson's policies towards Native Americans, the Indian Removal Act, and most famously the Trail of Tears, pushing Native Americans to lands west of the Mississippi, as well as the aggressive military actions during his years as a commander with respect to Native populations, demonstrate his focus on white male interests. One might even say that the Mississippi was his border wall. There are also echoes of Jackson in other places when it comes to Trump. One of Jackson's early acts as president was a thorough investigation into what he saw as corruption on the part of his predecessors, and he engaged in a massive removal of federal office holders thought to be loyal to the previous regime. These things are, of course, consistent with what Trump has sought to do in the past and what he intends to do, from what he's been saying, in 2025. But there are significant differences, too. No match is exact. And I'll close with one central difference between these two men, the way each of them handled the loss. We've talked a little bit about how it was the same. Both thundered about the outcome. Both felt that it was manifestly unfair. Both convinced their supporters of the fraud and convinced them to be angry about it with an anger that burned for 4 years. That much they have in common. The allegations against the deep state, if you will, then creates an environment for a presidential victory during the next election in 1828 or 1824. But here's the big difference. Despite all the anger from Jackson and his supporters, there was a peaceful transfer of power in 1825. Jackson did not encourage his supporters to try to change the outcome by force. He was focused throughout his career on the preservation of the Union, a key question that politicians throughout the 19th century, early 19th century, had to deal with great care. Jackson had no interest in tearing the country apart. Jackson had no interest in doing it even for the sake of his own political ambition, which, as we have discovered, is considerable. It may have been a great injustice, but his response was more or less, "I will see you in 4 years." There was no January 6th insurrection in 1825, nothing at all. And I leave you with the thought of how much different things would be in America today if, in this one additional way, Trump had reflected Jackson. If he had just simply said, Donald Trump, "I think I was wronged, and I'll see you in 4 years," we could have had the preservation of one of the most important traditions of the American political system. More than 2 centuries of the peaceful transfer of power could have continued without interruption. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to both of you for those presentations, and we do want to get to the audience fairly quickly because I'm sure you may have some questions for our panelists. Maybe I could get that Q&A going with a couple of my own. I find this comparison between Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump to be fascinating, and yet I don't hear it discussed all that much other than at a forum like this. Dr. Farnsworth, is this something that people should be paying more attention to as we try to understand this current administration?
Well, I think that it could be something worth offering for insights because in many ways the Jackson presidency, as I read it, had elements of retribution in it, and that seems to be a narrative that Trump intends to employ. I think that it's important to recognize, though, that these matches are not exact. I mean, even though we have a lot of media tumult in our time, and there was a lot of media tumult in the time of Jacksonian democracy, you still do have very different environments. I really don't think that social media is anything other than immensely more impactful on discourse than, say, the penny press was, for example. So it's not an exact match. What's the old saying? History doesn't exactly repeat itself, but it may rhyme.
Right.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah,
Dr. Feldman?
I'll subscribe heartily to that last comment. Whether we can find patterns in American history, like populist revolt against the insiders, that to me has historical value, and those patterns exist. And it's quite true that many candidates have tried to cast themselves as the outsider. Part of the oversimplification here is to say Jackson did it and then Trump did it, and makes Jackson just like Trump. Ronald Reagan ran as the the candidate against the Washington establishment. So did Jimmy Carter. There's a whole long list of them. But I think that kind of historical analysis can yield genuine insights. Whether Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump pull them out and say, are these two guys alike? That's where I part company with a lot of people. I see almost no resemblance between Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump. I think I understand the reasons why those analogies were propagated. Basically, if you go back to 2016, Donald Trump was still, in a lot of ways, an unknown quantity when he appeared on the scene. And everybody was trying to locate him. And Mr. Trump himself was furnished with the example of Andrew Jackson by several people, political writers and columnists and people like Steve Bannon, who said, you know, here's a model. The American public doesn't know you. How about assimilating yourself to somebody who was loved by the people, hated by the elites, and was a marvelously successful two-term president? You know, how about that guy? And so there was great political advantage to Mr. Trump in assimilating himself to Andrew Jackson. And I'm going to quote myself now. Donald Trump said, in almost these words, "I'm just like Andrew Jackson. I'm hated in Washington and loved in the country." And his detractors, who also found value in that analogy, said, yeah, you're just like Andrew Jackson. You're a racist, tyrant, bigot, demagogue. And so it served everybody's purpose to kind of amalgamate those two to each other. For reasons I won't detain you with, I think there's dissimilarities between the two men, between their personalities, between the way they governed, and you pointed out one of them, between the way they react to losing, that are every bit as important as the similarities.
Dr. Farnsworth, historian David Callahan argues that the 1824 election represented a clear transitional point toward more negative presidential campaigns. How negative was this year's election, in your view, compared to the election of 1824?
Well, I think I might part company with that theory a little bit, because we have to remember 1800 was a pretty nasty one too. I think that the dynamics are that when the stakes are high and when there is a great deal of closeness in the way that people view the race, nothing is left on the table. And that's, I think, a recipe for a particularly vigorous and combative environment. But there are, in the days before modern times, all kinds of combative commentary that would occur on handbills and things that were left in various places, printed pieces of paper. They didn't have nearly the reach of a tweet or a Facebook post, but they could be equally anonymous and equally devastating to the people who would hear about it. Whether, we have, I think, a pretty combative environment today. But I don't know that we can necessarily say that it was ever all that sweet and light in the past when there was an election that was close. Yeah. Sure, Wendell Willkie and FDR got along, but nobody anticipated that was really going to go down to the wire.
Right. Dr. Fowler?
Yeah, I'd agree. I've never been comfortable with the idea of ranking campaigns, from cleanest to dirtiest, because you're quite right. There's been a scurrilous aspect to every American presidential campaign. And also, it's partly how we view things in retrospect. There was a historian, for instance, very noted historian, who said that 1828 was the dirtiest campaign in American history. 28, not 24. And that kind of got its way into the textbooks. It was the dirtiest campaign in American history. How do you measure what's a dirty campaign? It's partly, in retrospect, which aspects of it we attach to when we look back on it, not when it happened. And I'll take 1828 as an example, because what you always hear when you hear anything about 1828, which I'm sure you do every day, is that it was the dirtiest campaign in American history because they slandered Jackson's marriage. The attack on Jackson's marriage to Rachel, on the grounds that she wasn't divorced when he married her, was a tiny little part of the campaign. It wasn't that important in 1828. It's important to us now. It's that aspect of the campaign, in comparison to everything else going on in the campaign, has just been blown way out of proportion. It was a minor accusation from one newspaper editor off at the margins. Now, there were a lot of accusations against Andrew Jackson that got a lot more publicity at the time and a lot more attention. Accusations about the way he had behaved as a general, accusations about the way he had disobeyed and contravened orders, accusations about how the way he had approached the behavior of a homicidal maniac at times. Do you call those dirty accusations? Because they're all true. You know, is it dirty campaigning when you say something about somebody that happens to be devastating and also happens to be true?
One last question from me before we open it up to the audience. Andrew Jackson really was the first president, I guess, where populism really was part of his appeal. It was the non-elites, it was the small farmers, miners, rivermen that he seemed to appeal to. And populism has pretty much remained a critical ingredient in presidential elections ever since. So, Dr. Farnsworth, when we look at the election that we just had, who ran the more populist campaign, do you think?
Well, we could distinguish between what was said and what policy options there were. When you think about the more populist campaign, I think the initial reaction is that the answer is Donald Trump. Donald Trump speaks to the anxieties, the fears, the anger that a lot of people in the country have, and channels those anxieties and fear and anger into support for himself. And that is his real genius as a politician. He's better at that than anybody I've ever seen in politics. And that's a populist message. When you think about policy outcomes, though, I don't know that he governs when we're thinking about, say, tax policy or something in all that populist a way. The benefits of reducing corporate tax rates or the benefits of reducing the top marginal tax rates for individuals, these are benefiting the elites. Now, Donald Trump presents himself as a tribune of the people, but if you look legislatively at what we see across those years of Trump's first term, we do see a pretty powerful dynamic of elites being well taken care of. On the Democratic side, I'll just speak briefly because the campaign was more or less about positively or negatively about Trump than really about Harris in any comparable way. I think Harris didn't necessarily speak working class, didn't speak populist. Some of the ideas that she talked about were more populist in their impact. When you're thinking about benefits for first-time homebuyers, if you're thinking about benefits for parents of newborns, you know, these are things that have significant dimensions for the mass public. But I don't think that people pay as much attention to the message as the messenger. And so on balance, I'd give the decision to Trump on that one.
Any additional thoughts?
As usual, I agree with everything you say. Certainly,
Well, that's always nice.
Certainly, if we ask which of the candidates more took the position of I'm for the common people against the powers that be, against your self-identified common people, that's Donald Trump. I realize I'm messing everything up, but I'm going to mess this up a little bit more by saying that the use of the word populism, which has become like pervasive in our very recently in our political dialogue, it still confuses the hell out of me. The word populism, I believe, entered American politics through its association with something called the People's Party, or as they were popularly known, the Populist Party, in 1892. Who adopted a platform in Omaha, Nebraska, which called for the American people to love each other. It also called for a whole string of reforms, some of which the progressives later adopted, and it called for socialization of the railroads and all sorts of things. A platform that's fascinating. People are still looking at it and trying to figure out which part of it is just rhetoric and which part of it is serious. But back when I was in grad school in the 1970s, the populists were the good guys. And the word had not acquired the negative connotations that it has acquired as it's all of a sudden become part of our discourse today. So I'm not sure what populism actually means. I think it's a word that we use now as a negative reference group or as a negative reference term. You know, we're against populist politics. I'd feel a little more comfortable if I knew what we meant by that.
If any of you members out there have questions about 1820, 2024, or anything in between. Yes, sir.
I have a question on this. Fascinating that, I'll speak up. Obviously, we had just basically two parties we were choosing from this time, 2024, right? A very simple choice almost, but even simpler seeming so in 1824. One party, you're saying, the Federalist Party has collapsed, you're getting three candidates from one party. Four party, yeah.
Four.
So how did they separate themselves? What were their platforms? How did they, distinguish themselves from each other? Because that's what we just talked about with Harris and Trump, right? How did they distinguish themselves? With like domestic policy, foreign policy, I'm the outsider. I'm the insider. I have experience. What was how they distinguish?
You're saying, like, what were the issues and the differentiations between the candidates in 1824?
Party, so how do you differentiate yourself?
Well, it's a very good question, which is a good way of saying, you know what, I don't have an answer, so let me think for a minute. Every professor knows that trick. And I could be here all day, but you don't want me to be. There were overlapping layers, as there are today. You know, you can differentiate the electorate today. You can talk men versus women. You can talk working class, other classes. You can talk urban, rural, cultural divides, and they all overlap each other, so it's not one thing. But part of it was regional. I mean, John Quincy Adams carried all of New England, all 6 New England states, because he was the New England candidate. Henry Clay's had a regional bailiwick in the Ohio Valley, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, Missouri. Jackson's bailiwick is in the Southwest, Tennessee, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi. Crawford's is in the Southeast, Virginia, Carolinas, Georgia. So that's part of it. It's regional. They also had personas rather than policies. Henry Clay was the only guy who really had a platform. And that platform was what he called the American system, which is spending on what were then called internal improvements, what today we would call transportation infrastructure, which was very popular in the western states, because these were states that wanted roads and canals and didn't have the population and didn't have the tax base to pay for them. If they were going to get something like the Erie Canal there, federal government was going to have to do it for them. And the other part of it was tariffs on imported goods. By the way, I heard President Trump at the Hermitage 4 years ago say that Andrew Jackson imposed tariffs on imported goods to protect American workers, and I'm thinking he did. I didn't know that. That was part of Clay's program, and it was on the basis of that program partly that he and Adams were able to reach agreement, because in fact, furthering internal improvements in particular was the main policy thrust of the Adams administration. And so without saying, you make me president, I'll make you Secretary of State, Henry Clay could, and I think probably did, go to Adams and say, look, I'm inclined to support you because the other guy's a maniac, but are you going to support internal improvements, because New England had been proverbially, traditionally opposed to them. And opposed to the tariff, too, by the way. You don't think of it that way, but at that time it was true. And Adams, if this had happened, Adams would have said, boy, I love internal improvements. If you want a bargain, there it is. And I've just begun to scratch the surface of this, but at any rate, there's no simple answer, but that's.
Questions, additional questions from our audience? Years pass. Anybody other than our first questioner? If not, do you have a second question?
All right. Well, this is kind of related, but I'm fast you, the gentleman who have knowledge of it. Once again, going to the modern day, we kind of almost divide into just two parties, like, blue is red, and, you know, it's, middle of the country's red, right? And the coastal elites, and vote Democratic blue, right? The shores. The country was much more rural then. So was there a difference in the breakdown of how people voted back, you know what I'm saying? How has the electorate changed over time? Because we have less farmers now. We have less rural areas, it's all in the center more. Of course, the country's bigger with purchases, but has things changed with being blue or red? Obviously, we've had more parties. Is there anything to that?
Well, you know, it's not necessarily the case that agricultural voices across American history were conservative the way they are now. If you think about, you know, the 1890s, for example, you know, the farmers were about raising hell in many ways because of all the money they owed and the vulnerability they felt to the East. So there's always, I think, a resentment towards the East, but that doesn't always take a conservative dimension in the rural Midwest. Well, you know.
It's not always voted like red or conservative.
Right, because, you know, the reality is that different things become very, very important at different times. I mean, if you're thinking about politics today, there's a great deal of emphasis on religion in politics, a great deal of emphasis on the engagement on the left and the right of religious institutions to shape the political orientations of their congregations. And that is a dynamic that is very, very present today. There's also the issue of a cynicism in politics today that I think is really important to note about our time compared to much of American history. Traditionally, when you ask people in polling, will the world be better for your children than it is today? America has consistently been very, very optimistic in answering that question over the 80 years or so that we have good polling in this country, until now. Okay? An awful lot of people today, compared to 20 years ago or 30 years ago, will say that their life is probably better than their children's lives is going to be. Very, very concerned about that. And that really scrambles a lot of this urban-rural dynamic that you're thinking of, because people who are very pessimistic about the future are overwhelmingly Trump voters. You know, and that's not because they live in the city or they live in the country or they work in a factory that is open, that is not. It's much more about this sort of identity about where America is and where it's going. We may have been unrealistically optimistic about America for 80 years. We're not that way now.
We pretty much need to wrap up. One quick question I have for you two, I don't know whether this could lead to a quick answer, but Andrew Jackson claimed that the 1824 election had been stolen from him. First, I don't know whether you all have researched that and whether or not that claim is valid or not, but apparently that was enough to sweep Jackson into office 4 years later, because he had this narrative of he had been deprived of something he had earned. And of course, even today, questions are raised about how fair the vote was and so forth by at least one of the parties. Dr. Farnsworth, do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think that, you know, my colleague's observation that the facts matter less than the spin really speaks to the answer. There isn't a lot of evidence that the 1824 election was stolen. There isn't evidence, there's no written document to show there was a corrupt bargain. It seems pretty clear that these two men were going to work together because the alternative was working with somebody they didn't like as much. And so you have that issue. Of course, the 2020 election, there's no evidence there that the election was stolen. It was audited and re-audited and over again. Every state that looked at the question and looked at it repeatedly came to the same conclusion. Joe Biden was the legitimate winner of the 2020 election. So the issue about the truth, in some ways, is sometimes beside the point when we're talking about passionate politics.
Nicely said. Nice wrap.
Well,
by
it's
the
the
way.
theme, you know?
The 1824 election was not stolen.
You're
There's
willing
no
to go on the
substance
record.
to the accusation that it was stolen, you know.
Right.
The vote was taken in public, everybody knew what happened. When Jackson said that it was stolen from him, let me say that while what happened was perfectly logical and from the point of view of Adams and Clay, not only defensible but right. One of the ironies here is that Henry Clay had to spend the rest of his long political career apologizing and trying to make amends for what he had good reason to regard as the most patriotic, high-minded decision he had ever made in his life, which was to support Adams, because Jackson's presidency, at least in Clay's eyes, fulfilled every dire prediction he had made about it. Clay once likened Jackson to a tornado sweeping over the United States government. It is also true, and this is why Jackson's claim wasn't merely made up. The alliance of Clay and Adams looked perfectly reasonable and logical and even necessary from their point of view. If you were on the outside of it, it looked weird. And the reason is that Clay was the representative of the Ohio Valley in the West. Adams is the representative of New England. These are two regions that had not gotten along, that to the extent that they had economic agendas, had opposing rather than coordinating objectives. Again, we think of the tariff in New England, the tariff especially, as being a New England policy. It was not. In 1824, New Englanders have been voting against tariffs, which the Westerners, people in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and Missouri and Kentucky really wanted. Furthermore, because they had kind of scoped out each other as possible opponents well before 1824, this was a very long campaign, Henry Clay's surrogates, realizing that Adams was going to be a strong candidate, had been trying to take him down for years and had published some rather startling and scurrilous and false accusations against him, to which Adams had responded in person. So to the extent that these two guys were known, they were known as political antagonists. Right. And so when two guys who you think have nothing in common with each other all of a sudden get together and do this, if you're on the outside of it, it looks crooked. In answer to your earlier question, can you find rural, urban, or occupational divides like in 1824? Basically, no, partly because we don't have the electoral data, partly because cities weren't that big yet. You could find later on in the 19th century something like that. Interestingly, there's a whole group of historians who made an argument very widely accepted a generation ago, that the basis of American voting throughout the 19th century was ethnocultural rather than economic. That you had a group of people of certain ethnicities and religious persuasions who always voted Democrat, and the other side always voted Whig. And there is something to that. One thing that is easy to forget is that in the 19th century, at least, when we say red or blue, Democratic or Whig, or Democratic or Republican, we're talking about 51% to 49%. You know, even in an area that is solidly Democratic, or among a constituency that's solidly Democratic. Solidly means a little bit more than 50%. We tend to simplify that with those maps that say this is a red state, this is a blue state.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Felder and Dr. Farnsworth for proving yet again that if we want to understand the issues of today, it doesn't hurt to go back, say, 200 years ago and learn from our history and put it in that context. You're wonderful historians and you're great storytellers. Please join me in thanking our panelists today. Do you have any parting words for us, Mr. Harris?
Thank you and good night.